Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that. I think you and I, as you said, could probably be here all day with a whole variety of questions because this is important to both of our states, and the interconnectedness of it all is practically obvious to us every day. But one thing I wanted to bring up and ask you, Dr. Balsiger, is this issue of climate change and ocean acidification, because we are seeing unbelievable impacts on this with our shellfish industry right now. Our oceans take up to 25% of our CO2, and this has changed the acidity by 30% over the last 250 years. So our oceans are on track to be 150% more acidic by the end of this century. So we have a couple of posters here that are something that we had to work with the shellfish industry, which actually shows the signs of impaired shellfish growth for our oyster shells, and crab shells are made of the same material. So we have obviously implemented this new buoy system and everything to measure this so that we can get the proper time for seeding. But another chart, oh, that's a nice stand there, thank you. Our second graph is the NOAA Oceans Fisheries Science Center, which shows the potential impact on ocean acidification on Alaska Bering Sea red king crab catch. So you can see that basically it is saying that we could have a significant reduction in crab available because of the same attack on the shells of this particular species. So my question is, does NOAA have what it needs to understand the impacts to the seafood industry of ocean acidification? What data do we have now on ocean acidification and how it could impact fish stocks? What do we need to get to make sure that we are addressing this issue?
Thank you very much for that question. And you have our data. I can see the charts. I'm familiar with those. At this point, fortunately, it's largely in the ocean is largely a theoretical possibility. But if you look at the declining trend and our projections of what happens to all of the carbon that's already in the atmosphere over the next few years, I think it is a cause for concern. We need to study this. We do have some programs in Kodiak looking at this, and of course we also have a part of the Alaska Fisheries Science Center is in Newport, Oregon, and I believe you have some material from there. So we're watching this closely. We'll be happy to keep you informed of where that goes.
Well, don't you, well, let me ask Mr. Oliver, how many vessels and jobs rely on the red king crab industry?
Let's see, the red king crab industry is something over, I don't know the exact number, Senator, off the top of my head, but over 100 vessels and, literally probably into the thousands of jobs if you look at not just the vessels themselves, but the secondary processing and associated industries. You're talking thousands of jobs, of course, in both Alaska and the Pacific Northwest.
Well, Mr. Chairman, on this issue, I think we definitely need a study to understand these impacts. We have obviously established a buoy system and information system as it related to the shellfish industry to give us important data that was critical. But I think these are valuable jobs in our region, and these risks are high. If this chart by NOAA is any indication of the drop-off that could potentially happen. So I definitely want to make sure that that NOAA and the IU's buoy program that we've developed might be expanded to look at this and to make sure that crab fisheries are that we're assessing these impacts. Secondly, I wanted to bring up about stock assessments, and I keep hearing from fishermen that the Magnuson-Stevens Act is working and that data supports the current framework, but when we don't do the stock assessments, or we don't do enough of them, or we shift them around as people are proposing, I just wonder, can we get from NOAA an actual cost of what it would take to do the fish stock assessments? so that we're not shifting resources between regions of the country?
Thank you for the question. I don't have that cost of a annual stock assessment in every region at my fingertips. We certainly can get that to you. We have developed, have been working on a stock prioritization scheme to discover where in the days of competing resources those assessments be done. We shared that with the council coordinated committee just last week here in this town. We're taking comments on that. We'd be pleased to provide that document to you as well. Thank you for the question.
But doesn't stock assessment equal jobs? So to me, when I think about how we're managing these fisheries, if you don't do the stock assessments, then you can't come up with a management plan. And if you don't come up with a management plan, then people can't, harvest this resource. So it all begins with stock assessment. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is we don't want to see a very limited pool of stock assessment dollars or trade-offs between region. We want, what is the amount of money that's needed for stock assessment, and what level can we fund, and what are the economic impacts of that?
Can I add one piece to this before you answer that? Because I think this question is, the hearings we've had here in the Northeast, for example, on the Northeast fisheries, their stock assessments are spaced much further apart. And how you can even do the correct determination of what those limits will be based on a 3-year stock assessment makes no sense. But so can you also add to this request kind of a chart that shows for the regions and the species how often you're doing stock assessments for the last, and I'll just use a number here and you can modify this, but I'll say for the last 5 years, what has happened? So we get a good picture, and then I think what Senator Cantwell's asked for is a very good question. So if we see the history and then you whip on top of that, here's what it would cost to get to what scientists would say is the right kind of assessments we need. What does that mean? But this history, I think, would be also important. I didn't mean to interrupt your question. I just wanted to add to it before he answered it. Please, back to you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. We can provide that, and although not exactly to the question, in the North Pacific Council, the Alaska Fisheries Science Center has looked at the cost in terms of reduced harvests because of uncertainty when you don't do annual stock assessments. If you do stock assessments every 3 years, you have to be more careful. And so because of the long history of annual stock assessments and production by species in the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska, we can show approximately what it costs if you have to deal with larger levels of uncertainty. So that may be of interest as well.
Do you know what a stock assessment is in general, like a basic cost?
Well, the stock assessment, of course, has many pieces, starting most typically with a survey in the ocean, a survey vessel, either one of NOAA vessels or a chartered commercial fishing vessel. And so that starts for a particular stock at a couple $100,000. But by the time you do the modeling and all of the people that are involved in those, that's a more involved question. We'd be happy to get back with better estimates of those. It's fairly easy to say what the survey charter vessel actually costs, but by the time you include the rest of the assessment, probably even including the time that the SSC looks at it to make sure it's correct in peer review, it's a more complicated question, and I'd be pleased to find some more details for that.
Well, I'm just looking at my own math in our region, but those numbers I gave you on this maritime analysis, and the chairman actually came to the Pacific Northwest. We had a hearing on some of these issues, or I should say a listening session on some of these issues, but we're saying that, the fishing impact is probably somewhere between, 15 to $20 billion. So if you think of that and the tens of thousands of jobs that are related to this sector, coming up and telling our colleagues, hey, we need to make these stock assessment investments so that this economic activity can exist in our country, seems to be a pretty basic formula that most of our colleagues would get, and I think would be supported by the industry. So I don't know of a lot of times when we can say, if we fund these things, here's the economic activity that's going to happen. But we know this, it won't happen without those stock assessments because we obviously won't be giving the green light to the level of catch and everything else. So anyway, if you could get us those numbers, I think that would be very helpful for us in this larger question of how to move forward with good science and good fisheries. And to say nothing, I know there's a lot of people in the audience here today of, this, vessel upgrade issue, Mr. Chairman, because as we get more efficient, there's all sorts of efficiencies that are going to be in place. So all of this goes hand in hand into, more efficiently and effectively catching the resource and more efficiencies in the system, but got to have the stock assessment to go along. So, these panelists remind me, obviously some of them are from the Pacific Northwest, but I just want to mention again how many people are here from the Pacific Northwest. That United Catcher Boats are here, Fishermen's Finest, Commercial Fishermen for Bristol Bay, the Ground Fish Forum, American Seafoods, At-Sea Processors Association, Alaska Bering Sea Crabbers, yes, that's in Seattle, and the Pacific Seafood Processors Association. I might add, Mr. Chairman, you and I were down at Fisherman's Terminal. We were on one of the boats and took a picture, and someone in Seattle said, well, when did you get back from Alaska? And so the fact that, our fisheries are so connected. But anyway, wanted to thank all of those people from the Northwest for being here, and we know how important the reauthorization of Magnuson-Stevens is for you. And I will just say, Ms. Curry, adequate resources for stock assessment. What I'm trying to propose here today is robust funding for stock assessment. I don't think adequate gets it done. And so I hope that we can work with NOAA and come up with something that is, that meets the needs of this part of our economy, because I think we're going to be challenged. And Mr. Levine, I didn't hear you say the word climate change or impacts, and so maybe we can get to that, but I got to get to Ms. Swanson first, so you can think about that.
If I can just add, we don't mind you talking about climate change here, okay? We don't have our heads in the sand here, so.
Well, we definitely want to make sure we're understanding the risks to our fisheries, and ocean acidification, I think, is huge on that. No matter what you want to say is what your global thinking on it is we have some real life situations that are occurring. But Ms. Swanson, I wanted to ask you about stock assessments and what's working and what isn't on that. And then I also wanted to ask you about vessel replacement, because part of this is making sure we continue to modernize. I think good fisheries management is about having the modernization of equipment as well. And how old are some of these vessels that you're talking about in the Ground Fish Forum, and what they need to do to be replaced? And my sense is here that somehow fishing and banking, fishing and financing isn't understanding something as particular as this industry and what you're trying to do to upgrade the equipment. So if you could answer those questions, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Cantwell. Regarding stock assessments, I think the key for the North Pacific is frequent stock assessments. If the assessments are less frequent, the fish stocks will still be fine. The management is very conservative. But what will happen is the less certainty we have in the stocks, the lower the quotas will be, and they'll be disproportionately lower. So I think the loss is to the nation in terms of the resource if we lose surveys. So I think it's very, very important, as you pointed out, the jobs and the livelihoods that are dependent on the North Pacific depend on frequent surveys. Regarding vessel replacement, with the rationalization of our sector, we're now in a position where we can start replacing vessels. Our vessels, I believe the newest vessel in our fleet was built in '86. The oldest, you're going to go back at least into the '60s. They're still safe and productive vessels, but they're not modern vessels. A newer vessel will certainly be more efficient. They'll be able to do much more extensive processing than the vessels that we have now. They'll be much more environmentally friendly as well. That since we've gotten past the obstacle of stability in terms of economic stability of the fishery, I think now the question is actually getting the contracts out. We have one vessel that is in the process of being built right now, and several that are close, I think, to starting as well. There's a lot of interest in some sort of assistance with vessel financing in terms of supporting loans to begin construction. I think that that's a good investment in a sector that is really poised to become world-class. Thank you.
And why isn't vessel financing just happening on its own? What's being missing there in the private sector that people don't understand about this business?
Chairman Begich, Senator Cantwell, I'm not sure I'm really qualified to answer that question. I think that in general there's some caution when the value of a particular entity is in the permit that it holds. And I believe that there may also be some legal constraints on the use of federal support as well, but I'm afraid I'm not qualified to answer beyond that.
Okay, thank you. I see my time's up, Mr. Chairman. Well, I just go back to Mr. Levine on that question about, you were talking about ecosystems, and isn't one of the biggest threat to the ecosystem acidification?
Thank you, Senator Cantwell, Mr. Chairman. And yes, that is absolutely true. And also, it shouldn't be just me talking about acidification or climate change. It's something that concerns all the people at this table and all the people in this room. And it is something that the North Pacific Fishery Management Council is considering and working to address. This ecosystem vision and the movement toward a Bering Sea fishery ecosystem plan, in part, will enable us to consider ecosystem impacts, not just from fisheries, but from potentially acidifying water, changing ocean conditions, from climate change and other effects, and make a robust and resilient plan for how to ensure that these fisheries make it through whatever changes are coming. And so absolutely, we appreciate your support for funding for research, your concern for ocean acidification and climate change, both you and Senator Begich, and certainly think that this is a place where we have opportunity to get in front of it, to understand what changes might be coming, and to prepare for them. And the best way to do that is to understand what's happening in the ocean and how the choices we're making about fisheries and other industrial impacts are affecting it.
Thank you.